大家好，这里是听广播学英语频道。最近美国校园发生很多抗议活动，您知道警方为何严厉镇压美国大学校园抗议活动吗？在一场有争议的严厉打压行动中，由于以色列在加沙的进攻，警方逮捕了数百名在哥伦比亚大学等美国大学抗议的亲巴勒斯坦学生。那么我们来听听专家的分析吧。
This is The Guardian.
Hey, Jane Lee here, coming to you from Wurundjeri Land. Almost 7 months into Israel's offensive on Gaza, pro-Palestinian protests are breaking out at prestigious college campuses across the United States, with students calling for universities to divest from their ties to Israel and for a ceasefire. In this episode of our global news podcast Today in Focus, Guardian US reporter Aram Salam and columnist Margaret Sullivan explain how this protest movement started and the light that it's shining on the political divisions over Israel in the US. Here's host Michael Safi.
There are no universities still running in Gaza. There were once 12. Since October 7, reportedly every single one has been damaged. 85% of Gaza's population is displaced, thousands of students and teachers killed. The war there continues. But this week, much of the world's attention was on campuses a long way away in America, and especially New York's prestigious Columbia University.
It's a beautiful campus. Obviously, it's an Ivy League university. It's old historic buildings. Cherry blossoms line the walkway of the university.
Aram Salam is a journalist with Guardian US.
Usually, kids are just sitting on the lawn, they're playing frisbee, they're doing what college kids do. In this instance, though, the lawn was covered with tents from the Encampment protest that's been going on since last week.
These young protesters have been condemned by some Democrats, many Republicans. They've been compared to the Nazis, which did not square with what Aram saw when she was there.
At the protest, students were sharing in a collective Seder in honor of their fellow Jewish students. They were singing songs and they were exchanging food and bottles of water. They were really, really well organized.
This protest camp and Columbia's response to it has become national news in America this week. Police have forcibly tried to remove protesters from campuses in Texas, in California. Lessons at Columbia have been moved online for the rest of the semester. Some Jewish students say the protests make them feel unsafe, that they veer into anti-Semitism.
We don't want no Zionists here! We don't want no Zionists here! We don't want no Zionists here!
In light of a real war in Gaza, where universities are being hit by missiles and bombs, it's fair to think this is all pretty minor. It doesn't mean much. But the stakes are high, because what's really being fought over between the students and those who oppose them might not just be what kind of speech is permitted on campuses in 2024. Lurking underneath it might be a bigger fight over the future of the US relationship with Israel. From The Guardian, I'm Michael Safi. Today in Focus, a national student movement for Palestine and the crackdown against it. Aram, what are these protests actually about?
These protests, specifically at Columbia and universities in surrounding areas like Yale and Princeton and others, they are about calling for a ceasefire, first and foremost, in Gaza. But more importantly, they're calling for their own universities to divest from their ties to Israel and the occupation in Palestine.
And today we're calling for Columbia to divest its endowment from the companies that it currently funds that are active complicit agents in the apartheid and colonization of Palestine.
So what kinds of ties are we talking about? What kind of ties does a university like Columbia have with the state of Israel?
So that's actually a great question. And that's something students are fighting to get an answer for, because there's not a lot of transparency about the financial investments Columbia has in general. But Yale, for example, they happen to know specifically that their university invests billions in Lockheed Martin, a weapons manufacturing company that supplies Israel with fighter jets. So those students there are protesting that specific investment.
Okay, so those students, after months of calling for divestment from Israel, set up tents last Wednesday on the main lawn of the Columbia campus. So far, nothing really unusual about this story. But then the Columbia president, Minouche Shafik, makes a decision that causes this whole thing to explode. What happens?
Right. So Minouche Shafik took a very drastic measure, and that's not even my own words. These are the words of faculty members I've spoken with, to allow NYPD onto campus. So New York police storms the campus and arrests many of these protesters. And these students are also suspended. One professor I spoke with called it an overreaction. There was also a faculty-led walkout in support of the students. And the faculty who joined this walkout, they actually, many of them vehemently disagree with the position of the protesters. But to have NYPD on campus was such a significant move that, even people of differing perspectives stood in support of each other and in support of the students who they believe have the right to peacefully protest and attend classes.
We demand the following: an immediate apology and amnesty for all students who have been suspended and clearing of their disciplinary records.
What were they actually arrested for? What crime had they committed?
It's not clear. I've spoken with protesters, one of whom was actually arrested, and she wasn't made aware of what exactly she was doing wrong because, she was telling me that she was peacefully protesting. In fact, they were sitting in a circle in the encampment on the lawn singing.
And this happened in the middle of the afternoon, so over 1,000 students poured out of classes, witnessed this mass arrest happening to their fellow students who were simply sitting and chanting and singing.
And faculty too. Yeah.
Faculty and staff witnessed it as well. And I think it was a really galvanizing moment for the student movement on this campus, which has already been extremely active and follows in the...
There were more than 100 students arrested on that Thursday. They've all since been released without charge. But for those of us who aren't familiar with American universities, how unusual is it to have the NYPD enter campus, handcuff students, lead them away? How big a deal is that?
It's a pretty dramatic scene. I mean, kids are getting arrested. Students are, zip-tied or handcuffed, what have you, by this police force. And Bassam Khawaja, who's a lecturer at Columbia Law School, he specifically spoke to how, these students were suspended without any kind of due process, and the fact that these students were evicted from their dorm rooms with hardly any notice.
And so really just collective outrage the way that the school administration has handled students who are essentially protesting for their rights.
Yeah. I also spoke with another professor, Helen Benedict, who teaches at the journalism school. And she told me that some of her colleagues were taking in some of these evicted students who were protesting. So it was a really dramatic scene. And as we can see, it's caught international attention.
Margaret Sullivan, you're a Guardian columnist and you're on staff at the Columbia Journalism School. I think for lots of people, it's perplexing that a protest at a university in New York has become a national issue in the US. And I want your help to untangle why that is. What did we start to see happen at universities across the US in the wake of Hamas's attack on October 7 last year and Israel's response in Gaza?
Well, students have really become politically involved in a way that in some cases they never have been before. On the Columbia campus for several months now, there have been students who have engaged in demonstrations, called for a ceasefire, expressed their views one way or the other.
We really want the university to understand that divestment must happen, and it must happen ASAP. We want the university to, at the very least, call for a ceasefire and acknowledge its complicity in the occupation and genocide of the Palestinian people.
I'm Jewish, I'm Israeli. My mother's Israeli, I have family there. And honestly, we're in pain. Our community was attacked. All of the Muslim people who I know, who I'm close with, have reached out to ask if I'm okay and to see how my family's doing. It's just when it becomes impersonal, people feel much more comfortable calling for violence, and I think that's not okay.
It's not at all surprising to hear chants or drum beats or things like that, but just in the past few days, it's gotten much louder, particularly because students have set up an encampment right on the lawn of campus.
Margaret, you're on staff at Columbia alongside writing for The Guardian. How have you noticed this conflict has changed the atmosphere on campus and in the classroom?
It's top of mind for a lot of students. I'm a little too young to have been a college student during the Vietnam era, but I think it has some of the flavor of that.
It's been bought out by the military. 50% of the research done here at this university depends on defense money.
And we can see when we look at the new buildings that are going up, we can tell how much this university is hooked into servicing the corporations and hooked into servicing the war machine.
Students have a kind of idealistic approach to this where they feel like they can make a difference by protesting.
Have you seen or heard things in your time on the campus that do strike you as anti-Semitic, or at least uncomfortably close to it?
There are things being shouted that are very anti-Israel. I think it is important to draw a distinction between criticizing the policies and the leadership of Israel and being anti-Semitic. They aren't the same thing. So I certainly have seen a lot that's anti-Israel. Most of what I've seen is people calling for a ceasefire. But I have not directly observed anti-Semitic behavior.
And we know from surveys of Jewish students that many of them say they feel there has been an increase in anti-Semitism since October 7. But do you see any difference between the kinds of things being chanted on the Columbia campus by students there and the things being done and said at those protests that are just outside the campus, when you try to understand why some Jewish students might be feeling unsafe?
Absolutely. There's a very big difference between what's going on campus, which has been relatively restrained. I mean, even the New York City Police Department, in making these arrests, characterized the protesters as peaceful. There is, however, just outside the gates of Columbia, on Broadway and on Amsterdam Avenue, some much more virulent protests, much more anti-Israel, much more offensive. In some cases, cheering on Hamas. And I think it's important not to conflate the two because they are quite different. And I think that Columbia has done a pretty good job and is working on trying to make sure that those who are involved in this encampment or in any demonstrations on campus are indeed Columbia students.
All of that student activism at Columbia and universities across the US has also drawn an extraordinary amount of attention from the media, from political leaders, and from business leaders. Why do you think that is? Why do you think so many people are so animated about the things going on at universities?
There are all kinds of reasons for that, coming from different directions. With students, there is less of an immediate connection with the Holocaust, with World War II. They tend to see Israel, some of these students, I don't want to be too sweeping here, but some of them tend to see Israel as a bully and not as a very vulnerable country that needs American protection. I'd say the thinking on that has changed in a generational way.
And that generational divide seems to be pretty vast. I mean, you've got on the one hand students who feel that Israel, as you say, is the bully, is the aggressive party here. And then an American establishment that, as we've seen over the past few months, doesn't see it that way, sees that the US has a kind of special relationship, a special mission to protect Israel.
That's right. And we see that with President Biden, who is probably an interesting case study here because he's a man in his 80s. He has a very visceral connection with what happened in World War II and a very strong relationship with Israel.
For 75 years, Israel has stood as the ultimate guarantor of the security of Jewish people around the world. so that the atrocities of the past could never happen again. And let there be no doubt, the United States has Israel's back. We will make sure the Jewish and democratic state of Israel can defend itself today, tomorrow, as we always have. It's as simple as that.
Many politicians of his era feel that way, not just because they're making political points, but they feel it deeply and emotionally. And that is just something that for many students who are 20 years old or 19 years old, it just doesn't mean as much to them. It's ancient history.
We've seen the Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu explicitly try to evoke that terrible history, to claim controversially that it's being repeated again in these protests.
Anti-Semitic mobs have taken over leading universities. They call for the annihilation of Israel. They attack Jewish students. They attack Jewish faculty. This is reminiscent of what happened in German universities in the 1930s. It's unconscionable.
You talked about this generational divide within the American left, but a lot of the critics, a lot of the people who have made the most noise about these protests have come from the American right, including their undisputed leader, Donald Trump.
They're closing Columbia now. I mean, it's just crazy. Columbia should gain a little strength, a little courage, and keep their school open. It's crazy, because that means the other side wins. When you start closing down colleges...
What role has the right played in amping this whole thing up?
Some of the politicians in the United States, particularly those who are on the far right, are, I would say, clearly weaponizing this conflict. So it's all part of this anti-wokeness that we've seen throughout the country in recent years, certainly in Florida with Governor DeSantis and book bans and all of that sort of thing. It's a way of saying these Democrats, these liberals, these progressives, these elite institutions are to be scorned and they're to be criticized. And we're going to, in some cases, try to humiliate them.
Margaret, we saw these fault lines really come to a head in December with the presidents of Harvard University, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania testifying in Congress at a hearing on anti-Semitism.
Institutional anti-Semitism and hate are among the poison fruits of your institution's cultures. The buck for what has happened must stop on the president's desk.
Tell me about that.
Well, they went before Congress of their own volition, although they could have been subpoenaed. And they were prepared, I think, mostly by lawyers to sound very, very careful. They parsed every word and they spoke in very careful terms, trying to tread this line about academic freedom and freedom of expression while still saying that anti-Semitism was a bad thing. And they came off, without a doubt, as too legalistic, not emotional enough about opposing anti-Semitism.
I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
Then there were right-wing figures who went on the attack, and, you know, the whole thing just went up in flames.
Tonight, embattled Harvard President Claudine Gay stepping down, abruptly ending her turbulent 6-month tenure as the institution's first Black president, the shortest term of anyone in that position.
The announcement comes less than a month after her congressional testimony that sparked outrage and intense backlash both from critics and prominent university donors. Gay becomes the second Ivy League leader to step down following last month's contentious hearing before the House Committee on Education.
What's interesting is that the day before the NYPD went into Columbia and cleared that first camp, Columbia's president, Minouche Shafik, herself testified before one of those congressional committees. What was her approach in answering those kinds of questions?
So she was much more ready to accommodate the demands and the beliefs of these right-wing figures who were questioning her.
Letters. We developed, in consultation with our anti-Semitism task force, a new demonstration policy which clarified what would happen to students who attended unsanctioned events. And that policy, along that we also worked with our faculty and students on, has a hierarchy of punishments. And
she arguably did not present a strong case for academic freedom, for freedom of expression, for freedom of assembly, and those things which are extremely important on campus. So I think that could be depicted as an overreaction to what had happened with the other university presidents.
Okay, let's talk about Columbia. Are there anti-Semitic professors on your faculty?
I certainly hope not, and if I have any evidence that there are, there
You don't
will
think
be
there's evidence
consequences.
of anti-Semitism among professors on your faculty?
We have seen some cases, and there have been consequences.
So Claudine Gay, the former Harvard president, tried one way to navigate this controversy, and that didn't work for her. She was forced to resign her job. We've now seen the Columbia president, Minouche Shafik, try a completely different strategy, and that also hasn't worked. She's found herself at odds with the left, criticised by the right. The House Speaker, Mike Johnson, was actually on the Columbia campus on Wednesday calling for her resignation.
And it's detestable, as Columbia has allowed these lawless agitators and radicals to take over. The virus of anti-Semitism has spread across other campuses.
Why do you think these university presidents who are so accomplished, so successful, why do you think they've struggled so much to navigate these fault lines?
Well, they've got some very different constituencies. They're trying to make sure that they don't anger their boards and their donors. And at the same time, you have faculty, you have staff, and you have many students who feel very, very differently and are standing up for rights that are enshrined in the First Amendment, which speak to assembly, to free speech, to press rights. These things are in conflict, and it's impossible to make everyone happy. And I think what I've come to think about is that in a situation when you actually cannot make everyone happy, the thing to do is the right thing. And while, of course, the kind of speech that goes after individuals or threatens the safety of individuals or doxes other students and hate speech is awful and shouldn't be allowed, at the same time, academic freedom, freedom of expression, freedom to assemble, the right to protest. I mean, there's a great history of that on college campuses, and I think that should be very highly rated as well.
So then what would that look like on the ground? What do you think is the way forward here for universities like Columbia?
I think it should be a last resort to call in outside police onto campus. That's something that should happen only when there's clear and present danger. And then I think efforts, which are actually ongoing now at Columbia, and I hope they'll be successful, to negotiate with students about what kind of demonstrations and protests are appropriate, where they can be held, what sorts of restrictions might be around them, to try to take an open approach that understands that emotions and feelings and philosophies are running high and going to be clashing.
Coming up, as protests grow and more students are arrested, where does this movement go next? Margaret, the key demand of students that kicked off this controversy was that Columbia should divest from Israel. Whatever relations it has with Israel, it should be cutting off in the light of what's happened in Gaza. Do you think that that is a realistic demand, something that Columbia and other universities might actually take seriously?
Well, I think it's hard for universities to do that entirely because there are investments that are complicated and long held. And so it's not as easy as sort of saying, okay, we're going to just transfer this amount of money to some other account. But I think that it's something that is possible in moderated ways. And the students are not asking for every contact with Israel to be cut off. Columbia, for example, has a strong program in Tel Aviv, and there's no movement that I know of to end that, or no thought that it would be ended. But it does have to do with investments, particularly investments in what students would call the war machine, investments that then go to weapons and the military.
We've seen in the past week what started at Columbia spread to universities in Canada, in Australia. Just on Wednesday, police clashed with young protesters at the University of Southern California, at the University of Texas at Austin. This movement looks like it's growing, it's getting angrier, and it's getting bigger every day. Where do you think all of this goes next?
It is something that is capturing students' attention. And I think when they see people like them, students of their age, who they're in sympathy with, when they see them being arrested and in some cases manhandled, they want to take part. And they understand that there have been a very high number of civilian deaths in Gaza, and they feel strongly about that. So I think this movement could continue to spread, and it actually could easily become a global movement.
What's striking to me is the sheer scale of the generational divide here, the gap between what these students want and what people like Joe Biden say. And it makes me think that what we're watching here is not a fight over what people can say at universities, that it's a kind of fight about something much greater, about what America's policy towards Israel might not look like today, but what it might look like in 20 or 30 years when many of these students might be in the media, in business, and leading the government.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is evolving, but I also think it's really important not to overstate. There certainly are a lot of older Americans who are sympathetic to the Palestinians. There certainly are a lot of students, particularly Jewish students, who feel unsafe on campus. So it's not a complete divide, but I think you are expressing the broad outlines of it well. And yeah, I do think that our relationship with Israel is probably evolving and changing right now, and we don't know what it's going to look like in the future.
Margaret, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me.